The institutional theory of ethnicity. In contemporary studies of ethnicity, methodological assumptions of new institutionalism are rarely used, although this area has a number of interesting studies in recent years. The research is at the intersection of institutional economics and social anthropology in the study of high-tech industries, ethnic networks of trade, distribution of public goods, understanding of local markets, contemporary ethnic conflicts, civil wars, ethnic violence, the everyday life of migrant communities, economic growth, economic politics, corruption, etc. This lecture is an attempt to summarize some concepts affecting the scope of the mutual influence of ethnicity, institutions, and social choice as an integral theory in the light of my previous ethno-institutional studies. The institutional approach is based on the observation of social behavior. To understand a social process means to determine the key rules that individuals use undertaking social actions associated with this process. This doesn't mean that institutions determine behavioral reactions, although there are a number of social situations where the majority of individuals follow the dominant rules. If the main laws of development of the institutional patterns are known, one can describe the social processes of identity formation. The main difficulty with the analysis of institutional processes is their recursive nature. From the standards of behavior, one may find the proposed actions of social agents who follow, obey, or violate institutions, but the possibility of reconstructive analysis is not obvious. One of the methodological solutions to the problem of targeting key rules of social interactions is institutional modeling. This idea was suggested by Lynn Ostrom. The study of social process through consideration of the behavior of social subjects with the subsequent reconstruction of institutions we can label institutional tomography. The analysis in layers, motives, rules, actions, situations, and the perspectives visualized or schematic allows observation, spatial and temporal institutional transformations. From the massive amounts of descriptive information, researchers can identify key behavioral motives or scripts, social norms governing interactions, and authorized actions within the institutional strategies chosen by the social agents and the structure of the situations which they face. On the foundations of economic, political, cultural, and the natural environment, one generates the optimal rules of social interaction. The effectiveness of the institutional model is empirically tested in a particular societal context. New institutionalists implement new rules, register emergent transformations in a community, and make the necessary corrections in institutional engineering. Sometimes institutional studies use laboratory experiments. Targeted norms of behavior are actualized in social dilemmas, both of conflictual and of cooperative nature, within the predefined cognitive and information parameters of interaction between the parties. After analyzing the results of game interactions, the researchers conclude whether the selected institutional model is admissibility or inadmissibility for the study of social behavior. Usually, for laboratory experiments, new institutionalists use variations of the prisoner's dilemma with the possibility of achieving or not achieving Nash equilibrium by players after a predefined number of moves. From the perspective of new institutionalism, the important meaning in the formation of identity is not so much the goal setting and rationality of omniscient individuals, for example ethnic elites, as the proponents of instrumentalism and constructivist belief, nor the inherent characteristics of social agents, as emphasized by researchers working under primordialism, but it is the institutional design of the social environment. Institutional analysis reveals behavioral similarities in the diversity of the rules and traditions. The corresponding features of ethnic institutions cause most ethnosocial processes. The institutional reproduction of ethnicity. Although the studies of institutions in general remain narrowly focused, interest has gradually shifted from the outcomes of institutional processes to the study of processes of institutional formation in new institutionalism. Ethnic behavior includes routine behavioral algorithms based on traditions and customs A permanent revision accompanies their daily implementation. This process I call institutional disintegration. The transformation of rules happens in accordance with the doctrine of justifiable mistakes, suggested by the Nobel Prize winner Oliver Williamson. Society permits some deviations from normative behavior for some people. Social institutions are rarely formulated with absolute certainty. Even after regulating the actions of the recipients, it is not possible to foresee all possible implications. The discretionary element of interpretation is not only necessary in the self-reflective clarification of vague institutional propositions, but also in the opportunistic desire of social agents to use situation-specific interpretations to their advantage. Mathematical models show that social agents who violate the norms are more effective in goal setting than convinced conformists. To violate the rules, one needs to develop the memory of previous interactions, as Axelrod and Hamilton wrote in 1981. Preschoolers with flexible behavioral responses are characterized by high intelligence, good imagination, more often than their more compliant peers. Violation creates social norms. Knowing what society considers deviant, one can see what is perceived as normal and acceptable in society. Knowing what is considered a violation of the tradition, the social sanctions that are used, and to what extent they are implemented, one can understand the extent to which the traditional foundations of society are sustainable. Although individuals don't have unlimited freedom of interpretation, the rules create incentives to generate exceptions to the rules. As institutional exceptions are formalized, becoming new rules, social behavior, which was previously considered deviant, ceases to be perceived as such. Informal monitoring of social behavior cannot be systematic and regular. Since the state does not give administrative powers to the ethnic groups, it is impossible to punish those who refuse to follow traditions or restrict those who want to live in an ethnic community. Sometimes the administrative powers of control are transmitted. In Muslim countries, religious councils control the compliance of financial institutions, food production, entertainment, etc. to comply with Sharia norms. Individual opportunism, which is limited by the need to pay the associated transformation and opportunity costs in linguistic, cultural, religious, and other spheres, is accompanied by negative externalities to the community. Society often stigmatizes violators of norms. Sometimes such violators consider themselves as deviants. Deviantization is the main stage in the formation of identity. Such an identity should cause public persecution or criticism, otherwise there will not be group consolidation based on preferences or justifying actions that are questionable or invalid under previous identification system. The probability of deviation grows as the society increases the possibility of non-recognition or the alternative use of some institutions. If the deviation has local distribution, institutional exceptions are formed. Such exceptions are behavioral oppositions to dominant norms. The institutional exception for the rules on the use of ethnic language will be the selection of another language code due to economic, social, or cultural reasons. When institutional exceptions are fixed in public discourse, it's obvious that there are some individuals who question conventional institutions and seek to replace them with new rules. One can find it by studying the history of communication in social networks and forums, where users discuss ethnic traditions, the reaction of others to the violation of the traditions, the education of the child's native language, ethnic conflicts, etc. The old norm of behavior is not wholly rejected. Its importance is constantly revised as a comparison, evaluation, discussion, and the introduction of new institutional practices grow. Reinterpretation contributes to the backward unraveling. The use of ethnic language, traditions, and native religion is narrowed to exotic behavioral patterns. Many members of the community leave traditional costumes for special occasions, celebrations, and ceremonies, preferring to wear modern clothes in everyday life. Unraveling in the ethnic sphere is the broadening of everyday implementation of an ethnic institution. For example, the use of traditional Ukrainian embroidery in Ukraine in everyday life. Structuring a new identity is associated with the deviantization of former norms of behavior and the simultaneous de-deviantization of institutional exceptions. Another approach to the problem of institutional development was proposed by Breton. He believed that in the ethnosphere there are parallel institutions on the foundation of which ethnic groups can participate in the life of great society. Previous deviations are reinterpreted in a positive sense, while external social pressure is rejected by conventional new behavioral practices. As Eric Byrne once pointed out, that behavior is determined by finding excuses, trying to get rid of social stigma, to reconsider its meaning, reset risks of previous behavior, and clear institutional space, while examining behavioral debris of unnecessary, ineffective, and outdated norms, individuals formulate a new identity, even if its rationale is not obvious. According to David Lettin, the optimal ethnic behavior is described by the model of competitive assimilation. Individuals try to adapt to the social environment, for example by studying the local language. On the foundation of instrumentalist logic, and considering the negative consequences of not studying adaptation strategies, parents will try to provide children with secondary and tertiary education in the language of the relevant state. It was about the Baltic states in Lettin's book, expecting that other parents will make the same decision. Although the instrumentalist hypothesis of the American political scientist appears logical, it doesn't explain current events in Ukraine. As rational as mentioned views and unsatisfied were the conclusions of those researchers who emphasized a fairly high level of assimilation and consolidation on the basis of the Ukrainian identity as a prerequisite for the formation of a civic nation, when the nation is understood not so much as an ethnic community, but as a nationality. The Russian-speaking population of the east of the country didn't want to assimilate. Many parents refusing to encourage children to the intensive study of the state Ukrainian language. From the institutional point of view, the duty to learn an ethnic language is equivalent to the unfair tax. The use of an inconvenient language or norms of behavior determines the failure in the competition. To the outside observer, the differences in the institutions of geographically and culturally close ethnic groups may look undistinguishable, while some actions may seem a relatively insignificant waste of resources. For example, filling in administrative documents in the Ukrainian language for the Russian-speaking people of Crimea prior to its annexation by Russia, or additional lessons in the Ukrainian language for the Russian-speaking students. However, a set of similar interactions creates a stable advantage for the titled Ukrainian group, saving on transaction costs due to the non-titled Russian-speaking communities. The advantage of one party can be seen, for example, of the gambling industry. Although the expectation of winning in a casino roulette doesn't exceed 1.3 to 5.3% depending on the type of bet and the specifics of the game, continuous transactions provide the industry of gambling with a good income. Even the most successful and experienced player will definitely go bankrupt after some time. External insignificance of institutional differences provoke ethnic conflicts because in the public consciousness of one of the parties there is an illusion that unfair rules can easily be changed through actions that will be cheaper for the ethnic community than additional costs. Developed countries compensate the transaction costs of the non-titular ethnic groups by government funding for education, culture, institutions of religious worship, etc. On the other hand, undeveloped countries usually face with inter-ethnic conflicts. Some norms of behavior are generally regarded as unpatriotic within Western and Central Ukraine. For example, the residents of Western regions usually condemn their Eastern neighbors for the excessive commitment to the use of the Russian language or mixed language, the negativism to national heroes, historical figures that many residents of the Western and Central Ukraine consider heroes, clothing, symbols, national slogans like Glory to Ukraine, holidays, etc. The gradual evolution of ethnic institutions deconsolidates society. Different behavioral strategies, effective standards, and cognitive representations of ethnic behaviors are difficult to lead to a compromise. The politically justifiable convergence is unreachable. A hero cannot be both a national hero for one part of the country and a traitor to the other. Such social norms were de-deviantized among those who support the authorities of new republics. The behavioral deviations became the institutional foundations for the structure of a new identity. Contrary to the methodological assumptions of instrumentalism and constructivism about the importance of ethnic entrepreneurs and historical political ideology in the formation of ethnic conflict, there was no developed historical mythology in eastern Ukraine. The ruling members of new republics were a pretty chaotically organized groups that are difficult to label ethnic elites. There was no movement of intelligentsia, which, as the supporters of instrumentalism say, tries to obtain tangible and intangible benefits from the construction of a new identity in the form of additional financing of the education system and culture, the creation of new textbooks and dictionaries, etc. The main predictor of the war was an institutional conflict, the competition among rules governing behavior in the public spheres. As indicated by Goodwin, the growth of Britishness was caused by the Second World War and the frequent German bombing of the English cities. From the institutional point of view, to resolve the ethnic conflict, one needs to reject the opposition between norms of behavior and ethnic identities. In Cyprus, the cruel phase of the intercommunal conflict was triggered when, in accordance with the Constitution of 1960, residents were forced to self-identify as Turkish or Greek Cypriots during the election. The institutional features of ethnicity. Identity is characterized by behavioral signature. This signature is a set of common institutional patterns and reactions to social situations, where behavior is a result of identification. The identical distinctiveness of behavior is not manifested in all social situations. Many behavioral reactions, for example in the sphere of market transactions, have a cross-identification nature. The individuals with different identities can have the same signature or behavioral style. In particular, individuals from different ethnic groups can choose the same risky speculative style of financial behavior in the stock market. But in many social situations, it's possible to allocate the identification of behavioral reactions. It doesn't matter how much and in what area ethnic behavioral signatures appear, if other groups fix the distinctiveness as a significant marker. Language is one of the important signatures of ethnic identification. For many ethnic groups, the opportunity for children to receive schooling in the native language is an important symbol. The use of other linguistic code in a traditional environment is often understood as a deviation from the norm of speaking the mother tongue, or even as a religious sin. Deviance implies foreignness of the sub-ethnic group, selecting institutional practices that are different from the institutions of the titular ethnic group or ethnic majority. The new identity is often structured through de-deviantization of rules of behavior that are perceived in the ethnic community as a violation of generally accepted ethics or traditions of the ancestors. As emphasized by Min, some new sub-ethnic groups, for example the Korean evangelists, are gradually forming among modern Koreans, many of whom don't follow Confucian traditions due to the influence of Western religious practices. Similar processes in some Chinese communities have resulted in the formation of new identification conglomerates with distinct institutional elements of Christianity and cultural traditions of Confucianism. Behavioral signatures separate local ethnic groups from the main ethnic group. Researchers noted the appearance of a number of peripheral communities of the new Cossacks on the fringes of the former Soviet Union, the Kazakhstan Russians, the St. Petersburg Estonians, the Uzbek Russians, the Russian Poles, the Pontic Greeks, the Russian Assyrians. One can find the increase in the number of sub-ethnic groups not only in the post-Soviet space. For example, in the Japanese diaspora, the identity of Nikkei is gradually forming. The title language in such groups is often replaced by local one. For instance, in the social environment of Russian Germans, the mother tongue is almost completely removed from the sphere of everyday usage to the area of symbolic significance. Russian Poles, Czechs, Greeks, etc. almost don't use their respective national languages in everyday communication. Among Russian Australians, the Russian language is losing its communication significance, and even traditionalist minded Euro-Chechens are gradually losing their native language. They are migrants, not necessarily of Chechen background, who moved from the North Caucasus into the European Union due to political, economic, and military reasons. Some ethnic institutions are structured along the ethno-religious lines of disintegration. The choice of behavioral rules that don't conform to religious norms often defines a new identity. Although the origins of the Amish in North America are not much different from the origin of the members of other Protestant communities who migrated from Europe several centuries ago, some distinctive behavioral signatures impose clear ethno-religious particularities. The Amish try not to use modern information technologies. They prefer manual labor instead of mechanized one. They adhere to the principle of social exclusion in relations with the outside world, etc. Ongoing institutional disintegration generates new communities or sects, Amish of New Rules, the Amish Beachy, etc., based on the reinterpretation of behavioral norms. For example, the Amish Mennonites are more tolerant than traditional Amish to modern technologies, electricity, phone, internet photos, etc. Another example of the institutional disintegration of ethnic identity based on religious criteria are Bosnians, who acquired the name Yugoslav Muslims only in the 20th century. Prior to that, for their neighbors, they were Islamist Slavs, Croats or Serbs with deviant religious identity, whose historic myth of collective origin was based on conversion to Islam. The institutional disintegration of contemporary Greeks is structured along the lines of ethno-professional identity. If one group creates musical instruments, as a rule, the other one plays them. Despite the artificial character of inter-ethnic divisions, each community considers only themselves as true gypsies. Even marriages between them are rare. Sometimes the criteria of institutional disintegration are transformed. Between the 18th and 20th centuries, an important factor of Armenian self-identification was spiritual closeness to the Armenian Apostolic Church, and sub-Armenian identities were structured mainly on the basis of deviant religious affiliation. There were special labels for such communities. Sub-ethnic groups of Armenians, Catholics, were called Franks, or Ferengi. At the turn of 19th-20th centuries, the ethno-religious institutional pattern was partially transformed into an ethno-linguistic one. Another example among sub-ethnic groups are contemporary Greeks. Based on the degree of use of other languages, along with the Greek language, researchers classify them as Romeos, Mountain Greeks, etc. Like the Armenians, general social causes for the transformation of patterns of institutional disintegration include the deconfessionalization of traditional space and the growth of inter-ethnic contexts, which increase the importance of the ethnic language and appropriate institutional exceptions. For many contemporary Armenian groups, the native language is not a necessary element of ethnic identification. Their everyday speech deteriorated from a long life outside of the motherland. These are the Don Armenians, and the Armenians who live in the Russian cities, who even at home mainly speak Russian, not accounting the cultural borrowings from the Russian cuisine, architecture, clothing. There is the exonym for the descendants of mixed marriages, Shurtuvazgai, inverted Armenian. In Russia, they usually don't know the written language, don't respect the customs, but may use an Armenian family name. In one sociological survey, the respondent Armenians said the longer they live, the less remains of Armenian culture in everyday life. According to the ethnographic data, some sub-ethnic groups of Iranian Armenian Muslims are considered a part of the Armenians Tatar in Iran. Only the older generations express their Armenian identity, who have Armenian names and surnames. Young people often identify themselves as Iranians. Sub-ethnic groups are in a common identical space, which doesn't exclude possibilities of expansion and transmission of ethnicity to the borders of ethnic groups. The ethno-identity transition of the Russian-speaking subgroups of Ukrainians, Germans, and others to the Russian ethnicity is the main reason for the increase in absolute numbers and share of the Russian population in the southern Russia. Since, in general, the demographic capacity of the ethnic group is limited, the increase in the number of one sub-ethnic group leads, in accordance with the principle of communicating vessels, to an internal cannibalism, reduction in the number of neighboring sub-ethnic groups. In peripheral isolation, sub-ethnic groups are linguistically separated from ethnic spaces of the parent culture and its moral world, therefore voluntarily forgetting their native languages. For example, the growth of the sub-ethnic group of the Digors, who have distinctive traditions, linguistic and psychological aspects of ethnic behavior, may lead to a reduction in the number of the Irani people among the Ossetians. Identities of the Digors, Irans, and Sipo-Ossetians were reflected in the list of the nationalities identified in the census. One can assume that those who identify themselves as Ossetians in general are less bound to ethnic institutions of the Digurs or Irans. Conversely, an individual clearly indicating the Iranian identity feels the pride of the ethnic culture and traditions of the Irani. Language assimilation transforms ethnic identity. The loss of the native language is the main reason for the assimilation of the Kurds in Turkey, where they are called the Mountain Turks in the official census, and the assimilation of the Meskhetian Turks in Azerbaijan. Ethno-linguistic differences are a source of re-articulation, re-rationalization, and recodification of the norms of the ideal ethnic behavior. They reflect the features of inter-ethnic communications and everyday institutional practices. For example, the Russian-speaking migrants in the US have formed a new language interference over recent decades. It is called Ranglish, in which the pronunciation of English words is distorted in accordance with Russian manners. This linguistic mixture of Russian and English was named by analogy with the Spanish-English Spanglish interference, semantically reduces discourse space and forming the identity of the Russian Americans. Sometimes the new community is called the Global Russians. They are characterized by unterritorial consciousness, anglicized speech, and weak identification attachments to Russia. The construction of new words, changes in meanings, and semantic relationships between objects, the use of specific grammatical categories, stylistic, syntax, and intonation for ethnic differential marking create a new perception of the world. As ethnic groups and social events, such a perception has the power of world creation, like Goodman said in 1978. There are no absolute synonyms. Niches for each category of identity are structured by semantic and stylistic differences. Changes in word leading to identity transformation. The differences among ethno-linguistic institutions are a breeding ground for the formation of new ethnic identities. The rigidity of ethnic borders, the construction of which are facilitated by institutional interpretations and discursive practices. Among the contemporary examples of language games, one can find the development of a Pomor's dictionary in the context of the ethnic group building of the Pomors as a sub-ethnic group of the Russian people. Individuals included in a sub-ethnic group or related to it become significant agents of adaptation. They reinterpret old ethnic institutions in the context of new behavioral requirements. Those people who use the old language and previous discourse interpretations are forced to realize their own otherness. They don't just express a different opinion, agree or disagree with conventional rules. They are not competent in the discourse sense because they don't use a new language and don't understand new truth. If the local community chooses similar institutional exceptions in linguistic, religious, culture, or other fields as a behavioral framework, a sub-ethnic group is formed. It is difficult to indicate the exact period where one can say with confidence that ethnic identity is formed. Institutional borders among an ethnic group and sub-ethnic groups connected to it are not always clear. Not all deviations are structured in the form of institutional exceptions, as not all institutional exceptions become the foundations for the formation of a sub-ethnic group. Even this process doesn't lead to the development of an ethnic group in all cases. Sometimes the rest of the society forces the sub-ethnic group to choose a clear identification, pushing it from the usual institutional space to make a final choice. In some cases, For historical, cultural, social reasons, a sub-ethnic group is absorbed by the parent ethnos. It happened with the Don Cossacks. By the end of the 20th century, the behavioral differences between Russians and Cossacks became so invisible, and traditions, ceremonies, and customs of the latter appear so exotic that many Russians call the modern Cossacks costumed. Ethnic institutions and ethnicity. Ethnicity is a set of ethnic institutions that reflect normative ideas about the ideal behavior of members of ethnic groups. Ethnic institutions indicate what is possible and impossible for members of the ethnic groups. Some researchers include in ethnic institutions territorial administrative units for ethnic minorities, a special system of education, language laws, ethnic categories for documents, programs of affirmative action, etc. My institutional classification is based on the institutional analysis of the Nobel Prize winner Lynn Ostrom. I categorize ethnic institutions as institutions of borders, who are the members of the ethnic groups who could potentially belong to it and who should be excluded. Institutions of borders are responsible for face control of the ethnic community to other ethnic groups. This responsibility includes the degree of acceptance or non-acceptance of the dissidents, of mixed marriages, migrants, displaced persons, defectors, those who left the land of ancestors and refused from ethnicity, language, religion, etc. in the past and now want to return. Institutions of activities. The valid fields of activities include ethnic economy, ethnic festivals. For example, in Scotland, many local municipalities organize special festivals to strengthen Scottish identity. Ethno-sport. Traditional sports disciplines are used to preserve the Sami identity in Norway, the Maori identity in New Zealand, etc. Traditional practices in ethno-pharmacology and ethno-cosmetology. Almost all leading companies of the cosmetic industry produce ethnic cosmetics. For each ethnic type, the industry of ethno-beauty offers a cosmetic line in accordance with the norms of aesthetic perceptions, thick and color of the skin, hair structure, distinctive ethnic hairstyles, makeup, climatic conditions, diet, frequently consumed dishes of the ethnic cuisine, etc. Ethno-medicine, including ethnic diseases. Specialists like Stepanov in 2010 in the field of genetic epidemiology. Exploring ethnic differences in the frequency of diseases indicate that ethnic identity should be considered in medical genetic counseling and DNA diagnostics. Certain cancer diseases are more specific for certain ethnic groups. In Russia, one can often find ethno-specific diseases among Yakuts. The popularity of ethnogenetic issues contributes to the growth of public interest to the problems of ethnic biological weapons. Procedural institutions, including ethno-linguistic institutions in particular, the communication rules for the use of a linguistic code for communication among us and between insiders and outsiders. Procedural institutions include behavioral hotspots. Social anthropologists emphasize that in the interethnic communications, one can differentiate Russians because of the close look. They look appraisingly, opposed to, for example, individuals from the Western countries who seemed not to notice other people. For the actualization of the ethnic identity in a foreign language environment, the Russians often use clothes. It's not so much the traditional national costumes, but the particular color combination and hyperbolic use of certain materials, for example, leather. For women, it can be a sophisticated makeup. Information institutions, rules of how to inform the ethnic communities about key events, acceptable cognitive and emotional reactions to them, etc. In public opinion of ethnic groups, there are different views about the possibility of emotional expressions, especially the suppressed ones. During socialization, members of the ethnic group not only learn the rules of speech, eating, and thinking, but also the existence of similar distributions of oppression. Feelings and emotions that are acceptable in one ethnic culture often seem inappropriate in another. The descriptive and prescriptive institutions chosen by the ethnic group are the social mechanisms of inheritance with accumulating behavioral patterns that are perceived as important behavioral codes from childhood. Ethnic institutions are not stable. They match to one another to have some institutional exceptions that occur in the gaps between the prescribed norms and actual social behavior in order for the ethnic identity to function effectively. The more things are wrong, defective, or deviant from the ideal ethnic behavior, the weaker is the identity and the more vulnerable it is to deformations. Ethnicity is constructed on the basis of ethnic behavioral norms that are developed in accordance with the laws of institutional disintegration. Institutional disintegration begins as a result of the growth of default rules in linguistic culture or religious spheres, like lawyers who use situational variety, the potential for overestimation and any ambiguity in unclear formulations, ethnic actors who broaden a set of softening reasons or failures to observe norms choose rules that are regarded as deviations by the majority of the population. The gradual growth of deviant ethnic rules broadens the sphere of normative permissibility and makes it possible to ignore conventional traditions. Institutional exceptions are special rules, the applications of which are limited to situational interpretations of social agents. The exceptions can be interpreted as an opportunistic violation of institutional commitments to other social agents or the entire community, or as a creative concretization of the institution, following its spirit and not the letter. As a mirror reflection of institutions, suggesting the existence of ancestors, exceptions are structured in binary opposition. Situational interpretations replace the original meaning of regulations with a different or opposite meaning. The verbal construction of explanations and excuses are written on a yes however foundation. The extenuating circumstances will broaden until exact compliance with institutions that were regarded as a norm becomes the exception. Ethnicity is a special form of transmission of institutional connections and rules of behavior in a community. It is impossible to transmit ethnicity into a new group in the same form that was used for the previous group, since the borders of the observance and violations of the rules are not always clear. The increase in the number of deviant rules and the possible synergies among them helps to first form the situational deviant identity and then the categorical one. Some cracks and dislocations within dominant ethnic institutions are first formed in behavior and then in ethnic self-consciousness. Following an increase in transformative ethnosocial contradictions, default rules that are embedded in the institutional lattice of any identity in non-structured forms are associated with the ethnic subgroup's deviant identity with public consciousness. Institutional disintegration provides group dynamics. New ethnicity restrains the process of deviantization of the space of everyday interactions by transforming previous deviations into conventions. De-deviantization helps individual consciousness to adapt to incorrect and ineffective and defunct institutional practices. New ethnic group creation destroys previous intergroup deviations by resetting excessive obligations, traditions, and norms of the former group, and such deviations are then considered normal. The new ethnic identity, providing further institutional development, creates a new behavioral space in which people can use new behavioral rules and not be constrained by the weight of ethnic history, deviant remnants, the tale of ineffective institutional practices, institutional limitations, or zero non-working institutions. The formation of ethnicity is associated with the growth of heterogeneity in the institutional space, the existence of multiple regulations or interpretations of social actions lead to behavioral uncertainty. Ethnicity appears when a critical mass of institutional deviations is reached, when one needs to legitimize such deviations. There are few institutional deviations in traditional society, and new identities are not formed because complex social-cultural mechanisms hinder the development of new behavioral rules, the most famous of which is taboo, like Fraser explained. There are patrimonial and clan-based social organizations in traditional societies. Ethnogenesis is stirred up only during increased inter-tribe and inter-civilizational contacts, colonial invasions, and so on. When Europeans arrived in a traditional community, they suggested new patterns of behavior to local residents, who were prepared to adapt a de-indigenized identity. There were stigmas towards locals who hypertrophied borrowed European behavioral practices, clothing, communication style, language, etc. in almost all colonial territories. As institutional space becomes de-homogenized, the implicit obligations of the members of the community to protect institutions of culture, language, etc. are no longer in force. Ethnogenesis is based on inherited ethnobehavioral patterns. The institutional connection of ethnic groups with their ancestors is traced through cultural, linguistic, and territorial elements from distant times. Ethnic groups cannot precisely indicate the actual sources of their traditions and norms, although all ethnic groups have detailed ethno-historical myths about the past. The approval of ethnic institutions, their long and practical testing, natural and smooth operation increase their potential applicability, ethnomarketed normativity, and commonplace character of traditions. The commonality of ethnic institutions is evidence of successful ethno-institutional transmission, that is, cross-generational transmission of ethnic institutions, such that social opinions about the primordial deviant character of group identity is lost, forgotten, or go into disuse in active public discourse. The cross-generational transmission of norms of ethnic behavior is restricted by the perceptual and cognitive frameworks of individual interpretations, the social force in which new members of the group share beliefs, the presence or absence of a shared institutional space, and antagonistic behavioral rules. The more differentiated group members are, the more the monolithic institutional space is contaminated by other patterns of behavior with which one needs to compete for attracting the attention of social actors. This reduces the likelihood of successful cross-generational transmission of identity. Although the maintenance of ethnicity requires some resources in order to participate in ethnic holidays, study ethnic tongues, traditions, religious practices, etc., social actors don't tend to de-ethnicize. There are some institutional reasons that motivate people to be a part of the ethnic group, even in situations where such membership is inconvenient or expensive. Firstly, from the institutional point, ethnicity is a weak form of social identification in comparison with other forms. It allows social agents to violate some behavioral norms in everyday cultural, religious, or linguistic spaces, while not becoming completely disloyal to the ethnic community. Implementing institutional mimicry, one can create an appearance of following ethnic rules, traditions, and even linguistic norms, while actually violating them. Institutional weakness is a source of identification sustainability, allowing the individual to come to terms with their own behavioral imperfection, not knowing the language, religious norms, traditions, culture, etc. In the professional field, failure to follow rules of behavior leads to the obvious deprofessionalization. Usually, individuals from traditional communities with a strong institutional regulation of ethnic behavior seek to migrate to zones of weak identity, like USA, Europe, Russia, where there is a high level of tolerance to behavioral violations which are not subject to criminal law, even if the migration is not always justified economically. Secondly, ethnic socialization is embedded in natural processes of socialization and it is implemented virtually without effort. Opportunistic desires to refuse maintaining ethnic culture, language, or religion and instead engage in other activities are constrained by rational expectations of benefiting from long-term investments in the ethnic group. One needs minimum resources and maximum internalization to learn the ethnic behavior. Their participation in the life of the ethnic group allows social agents to socialize children with minimal cost during daily interactions. To transmit another social identity requires more resources. For example, one needs to take affirmative action to learn a chosen profession, special education, experience, and so on to socialize professionally. Ethnicity is a long-term cross-generational institutional commitments that have a transferable utility, that is, the utility to transfer from one social agent to another. The transmission of ethnicity doesn't need any mechanical calque of norms. They can be, and actually are, fuzzy and vague. To teach the second law of thermodynamics, it is necessary to know the formula and mathematical proof. The more accurate the information, the harder it is to transmit. To paraphrase an ethnic history, fairy tale, legend, or myth, one needs general ideas. One can add new storylines, change the places of actions, character names, etc. Even learning the ethnic language almost never requires the precise knowledge of the rules of grammar, pronunciation, or spelling. Parents can and actually teach their children ethno-linguistic rules in imperfect form, to the extent they know themselves. A high degree of transmissibility of ethnic institutions is the main social evolutionary advantage of ethnicity in comparison with other identification forms of structuring social life. In relation to the existence interactional space, a new social agent is a type kind of migrant who has to decide whether or not to respect behavioral norms adopted by the community. If he chooses deviant behavior, he has to decide the ground situations to whom and how to make excuses, both justification to significant others and self-justification. He also has to find ways to avoid punishment in situations of external monitoring and detection of his deviations, whether or not to teach his children new institutional practices, etc. One needs to decide how to transmit deviations, that is, the rules where the community would interpret them as violations of traditions they are obliged to follow. Some traditions may look confusing, challenging, and even frightening to the outside observer. The self-exotization of norms is one of the major institutional mechanisms of preserving community. Many exotic rules of behavior, which require resources, are followed for identification reasons and not for rational economic calculations. A new identity has emerged as a social cognitive way out of institutional uncertainty, when it is expected that the social agent has to follow the rules and violate at least some of them. Cognitive researchers have shown that the opposite incentives lead to the negative social psychological reactions and emotional stress. Identity crisis is based on the fact that rules don't meet change situations. New identity allows individuals to dampen cognitive inconsistency and consciousness congestion in terms of cognitive dissonance between the need to follow the normative ideal strictly and the practical impossibility to do it. Ambiguous morality, when one can choose between two alternative norms of behavior, creates social psychological stress. For example, speak one's mother tongue in community interactions or prefer another international language, use traditional wedding rituals, or follow a modern style of marriage. This social psychological stress is reset by not following traditional patterns of behavior and transitioning to a new identity, licensing for new social actions. Identity is the aggregate result of many institutional choices made by different people at different times. However, average rules can satisfy only the average individual. The importance of identity at an individual level is determined by the price of replacement with competing alternatives and accounting for transaction costs due to institutional constraints. Identity has different signatures for different individuals depending on the specifics of behavioral positioning. For those who prefer an ethnic cuisine in the structure of identity, one can most likely find the appropriate consumer and nutritional behavior in accordance with the rules adopted within the ethno-social environment. The changes in culinary interests and nutritional preferences, because for example moving to a new place of residence, will inevitably transform the behavioral patterns of such people, and it will be reflected on the level of identification. Social behavior must be morally and situational justified. Identity is an important mechanism of self-rationalization of behavioral choice. It is a pretty compelling reason for compliance or non-compliance with certain rules, and for taking certain social actions which are associated with the identity in public consciousness. Rationalization is initially strong. References on identification reasons are more convincing for public consciousness than references on situational, political, or economic factors. Society must believe that members of the ethnic group follow traditions for internal emotional, affective, or cognitive reasons, and that instrumental and situational causes of economic benefit from the behavioral exoticization are not the main reasons, even if they are. The legitimization of the rules of behavior, especially if they seem unusual for society, is impossible without reinforcements of identification. They are used for cognitive anchoring of identity with social reality. Wearing Cossack stripes on a daily basis may not be as convenient as wearing jeans. However, anyone who regularly wears such clothing confirms their identity, which differs from the identity of those who wear similar costumes only on holidays and those who don't wear them at all, however self-identifying as a Cossacks. In the severe cognitive and axiological dichotomy between the need to follow institutions in order to show conformity with dominant social expectations and the pragmatic preferences for situational deviances, identity allows individuals to change the logic of institutional positioning, providing the community with a moral justification of behavior. Ethnicity strengthens any social identification institutionally. To survive, groups must include new members, each undertaking self-identification, bringing their interpretation of social reality, and with their own attitude to compliance and possible violations of group norms. Identity transmission almost never happens if institutions are complex, confusing, or weakly connected with altered situations and incomprehensible to new generations. Thus, if the increase in group size is mainly due to the influx of new members and not through socialization and identity inheritance, such identity doesn't become an ethnic one. Profession is a key intentional factor determining the social position of a person in the contemporary world. There are clearly defined institutional criteria of status as well as formalized administrative authority in professional communities. These functions ensure adherence of professional standards among colleagues and enforcing formal legal sanctions in some cases, for example, prohibition to practice or revocation of a license. There are some difficulties in generational transmission of professional identity, despite succession in some professions, for example, the military. However, when specific groups are closely identified with certain professions, resulting in caste systems, the professional identity space inevitably becomes ethnic. Ethnicity dominates in a society where the costs of alternative socialization patterns are huge. Conversely, de-ethnicization happens when the costs attached to non-ethnic socialization reduce. De-ethnicization is not the rejection of ethnicity in general. Individuals who are cosmopolitan in everyday behavior may experience a sense of national or ethnic belonging watching football teams from their country or individual athletes of their ethnicity. It is the process of restructuring the ethnic institutional space when other forms of social identity occupy institutional gaps. Although subcultural groups have special slangs and traditions, from the institutional point of view, new social movements are artificial. Samaishis, Jedi, Emo, and so on are not ethnic groups, despite the fact that, for example, Jedi are officially recognized in many countries, and in Great Britain, New Zealand, Canada, and other countries, hundreds of thousands of people consider themselves to be Jedi. It is incorrect to consider individuals who identify themselves as orcs, goblins, Jedi, etc. as irrational. The task of the researcher is to find the signal and sociological elements from the informational noise to explain the rationality of all unusual practices. Individuals cannot make mistakes selecting a wrong identity. Mistakes only relate to the methodology of a particular study. However, there is no institutional link with the past with such subcultural groups. They are the product of rational construction by intellectuals writers, bloggers, and public figures in the pure form. Although such subcultural groups have institutional characteristics of real ethnic groups, new group membership participation, the priority of in-group language communication in in-group interactions, such communities spend a large amount of resources on an everyday activity, preparation of special clothing, slang, English language, the language of the orcs, etc., monitoring and control of the behavior of group members, etc. Their distinguishing features hang loose in the air in the historical sense. It is impossible to determine the ethnic groups from where their features were borrowed. It is also unclear on what basis and when such institutions become deviant. The lack of inherited institutional patterns, gaps in institutional memory, and the weakness of institutional transmission pose challenges for such groups to replicate themselves in the cross-generational dimension. However, it is possible to construct sub-ethnic groups that can add some confessional and pseudo-confessional components along the lines of institutional disintegration. For example, in the dominant Australian identity, Buddhists become Australian Buddhists, who become Australian Buddhist Jedi. If the existing ethnic identities are anchored in new postmodern identities and a conventionally convenient identification hybrid is formed, which is successfully transmitted over several generations, ethnic subgroups that have the same Jedi identity as the institutional marker could emerge. Ethnic groups cannot appear or disappear suddenly. They remain connected to some extent with the parent ethnic community in some cultural, linguistic, or religious way. People don't follow the institutions of an old ethnicity when your loyalty to them becomes autonomous, situational, and discrete. When historical arguments are used to explain the formation of new institutions to the community, then invocations of institutional exceptions become cultural and identical rather than situational or conventional from the point of everyday utility and rational usage. Institutional exceptions are normalized and become acceptable. This hinders further differentiation of the ethnic subgroup, strengthens its resistance to possible assimilation, and becomes a source of conflicts within the main ethnic group. Ethnogenesis depends on the successful institutional transmission of new rules and their strengthening in public discourse. The ethnic community appears when there is public agreement about institutions and non-formalized exceptions. Ethnogenesis is completed when institutional differences in expected social behavior between the ethnic group and its neighbors become noticeable to external observers. The ethnic identity is crystallized in social interactions at the moment of de-deviantization of institutional exceptions connected with it in the public consciousness. Classical ethnology and institutional approach. Classical ethnology believes that there is a clear articulation of all forms of identification. One can assume that there are lower and higher forms, structured in a sort of pyramid of identities. In ideal cases, the individual is a member of the family, the ethnic group, the regional community, the national state, and at the macro level, he is simultaneously a member of humanity. However, multiple identities are not congruent in many social situations. The social distance scale in 1926, which has been used for almost a century, comes from direct correlations between positive and negative attitudes toward a group and the degree of acceptance or rejection of a member of the group in different social situations, depending on various degrees of spatial proximity and the intensity of interpersonal interactions. One believes that if an individual is ready to accept a person from a different ethnic, racial, or religious identity as a member of his family, he will also accept him as a work colleague or neighbor. Sociological studies don't confirm the social distance scale hypothesis. The institutional context of the social situation is more important than formal ethnicity. Often, people don't have objections if members of the family want to marry with individuals stigmatized in society. In modern society, communication with relatives is quite formal. There are a few meetings each year for specific reasons. Even following different rules of social behavior, family members will try to adapt to one another, and institutional conflicts are generally rare. Among partners, there must be a certain congruence of institutions governing family relations for successful marriage, unlike the rigid behavioral situations of work or a neighborhood, where an individual's preferences are limited, since it is difficult to refuse to talk to unpleasant people. Or one needs to identify the rules of cooperation. The spheres of family and friendship provide a relative freedom of institutional choice. There is little risk of using incomprehensible or annoying behavior in friendship. Friends are free to design linguistic or religious institutions which are most convenient for them and at the same time tolerant to individual differences. It's not surprising then, according to surveys by Moscow sociologists, only one-third of respondents mentioned that nationality is important in friendship. The territorial neighborhood, with representatives of other ethnic groups, is a different situation, at least in the Russian institutional context. Individuals with different norms of behavior, those people who organize loud ethnic rituals, eat animals that are unusual for the local population, violate generally accepted health and sanitary standards, etc., are often perceived as poorly predictable. They can both be aggressive in interpersonal communication and involve the neighbors in conflicts with state authorities. In such cases of neighborhood conflicts, and depending on the nature of the violations, one may need to involve health authorities, fire departments, law enforcement agencies, to collect signatures from other neighbors as witnesses, to go to court, etc. The high potential transactional costs explain why 40% of respondents polled by sociologists of the Russian Academy of Sciences emphasize the importance of ethnic identity in certain social situations, for example in rent. It adverts on specialized forums and local newspapers. Many property owners prefer to specify the acceptable ethnicity of tenants, an apartment for rent to a Slavic or Russian family. Thus, these sociological data indicate that both the state's regulations of institutions relating to living in a common territorial space, floors, driveways, etc., and against neighborhood violators of the order and peace of other citizens are ineffective. Unclear institutional standards of interaction in a common space determines the household localizability of ethnicity. Negative feelings and anti-migrant views against workers or citizens of other ethnicities are not so much the result of the inherent xenophobia, racism, ethnocentrism, past history, etc., as the impact of institutional uncertainty on social behavior. Another position of classical ethnology, which can be clarified by the institutional approach, is the postulate of a significant social force of ethnicity and ethnic loyalties. In the analysis of ethnic conflict processes, other points of view have been seldom studied. It is assumed that the strong form of identification makes people under ethno-ideological influence from the ethnic elites engage in inter-ethnic conflicts to protect territory, culture, language, etc. Social anthropological studies have shown that individuals enter into ethnopolitical conflicts because of their ethnic identities. However, the classical ethnology doesn't explain paradoxical social situations. For example, the so-called Western Armenians who traveled to Karabakh from Western countries between 1980s and 1990s were willing to fight and die for the land of their ancestors. Surprisingly, they were not prepared to learn the Armenian language, to some extent to communicate with the local population, at least at the elementary level. Institutional theory can explain such paradoxes. Armenianism is most likely not based on linguistic criteria. Even not knowing the Armenian language, one can be perceived by society and consider himself Armenian. For comparison, one can observe the negative social impact of the institutional practices of many North Caucasian ethnic groups on the process of ethnic mobilization. The flow of foreign volunteers who were willing to participate in the Abkhaz conflict or Chechen wars was much smaller in comparison to the number of the Armenians who came to fight for Karabakh from Syria, Russia, France, USA, etc. And this was despite numerous diasporas in Turkey, Syria, Western Europe, North America, etc. From the institutional point of view, it shows that rigidity of institutional requirements and some intransigence of idea of ethnic behavior. If members of an ethnic group perceive as traitors those who don't speak their native tongue, don't follow traditions, or whose ancestors left the national territory in the past, it is unlikely that the discriminated sub-ethnic groups would be willing to fight for the interests of the mother ethnicity. The harder the institutional regulation of ethnic behavior, the less the potential of mobilizing resources. If ethnicity is a strong form of social identification, as the supporters of constructivism and instrumentalism believe, there would be some constant ethnic tension in society. Increasing inter-ethnic interactions would always result in intense ethnopolitical conflicts. However, in practice, most parts of social space are free from inter-ethnic conflicts and tension. Even members of hostile ethnic groups and nationalist parties fly together in a plane peacefully. There are not many ethnic clashes on trains, ships, shuttle buses, etc. In addition, one can rarely find ethnic conflicts in commercial organizations, such as hotels, supermarkets, fitness centers, etc. Although there are a number of people with different religious and national traditions, attitudes, and social stereotypes in a small and restricted space. Ethnic conflicts reported in mass media mostly happen on streets, parks, squares, roads, etc. In institutional terms, these are common spaces that require targeted institutional regulation, since specific institutional cover is absent. The quality of the institutional environment determines the likelihood of ethnic conflicts. Social behavior in transport is clearly regulated and constantly monitored. Officials know almost all deviations. The private commercial sector, such as hotels and shopping malls, also has clear rules of behavior and resources to monitor deviations. Even if objective social factors predict the high level of social xenophobia and ethnic tensions in Russian society, the effective regulation of the institutional space ensures conformity of individuals' behavior to social norms and institutional expectations. Therefore, effective national politics must be institutional by its nature. Perspectives of ethno-institutional studies. By nature, ethnology is an institutional science. In the words of one anthropologist, it is impossible to answer the fundamental questions in humanities: what is common in humans and how they differ, in isolation from the study of behavioral issues. Institutional analysis allows one to move from the studying history of the development of ethnic groups to studying the structure of such development. However, the institutional explanation of ethnicity often doesn't fit into ethnology's traditional way of thinking. Available empirical data are mostly useless. They are rarely used to check the institutional hypothesis and are rarely available in aggregated forms. Traditions and norms are studied as isolated facts in themselves, rather than as a logical sequence of institutional transformations. The rules of behavior are generally considered as a background for ethnological studies, but not as their foundation. Scientific discussions are organized in the context of searching for the Holy Grail, which is considered suitable not only to study ethnic processes, but also to formulate an effective national and migrational policy. The institutional approach transforms the usual logic in a nonlinear way. It shows that traditions, which are effective in a local culture, can be transformed in the processes of institutional disintegration into non-optimal rules of behavior. This leads to the growth of ethno-conflict processes. Furthermore, some initially deviant behavioral violations can be the foundations for the formation of a new identity. The imperfection of ethnicity and ethnic institutions are a part of the overall process of ineffective social evolution, and uncertainty of ethno-institutional development is a special case of the non-linear nature of the development of social systems. In this world, there is a place for an occasion and there is one for the law. This is why institutions are important and interesting for ethnological study.